Crossing an empty street sounds harmless, right? But who would have thought it would lead to an arrest, a cage in the precinct's back lot, and the loudest scandal the town had ever seen? It all started with a couple of biased cops trying to flex their authority, but what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Miriam Edwards was not someone who typically drew attention. At 67 years old, she was a retired schoolteacher with a steady gait, silver-streaked hair neatly pinned, and a calm presence that spoke of years of patience. She wore a light cardigan over a simple floral dress, trying her best to stay cool on one of the hottest afternoons of the year. The sun beat down relentlessly, making the pavement shimmer, and the shade seemed to retreat into the cracks of the buildings. The crosswalk was 2 blocks down, and the road was practically deserted. With no cars in sight, Miriam decided it was quicker to cross then and there, rather than endure the sweltering heat any longer. She stepped off the curb, her sensible shoes padding softly against the asphalt. She'd barely made it to the other side when a police cruiser came screeching to a halt behind her. The blare of its siren shattered the heavy silence, turning heads. A few people stopped mid-stride, their curiosity piqued. From the cruiser stepped Officer Grant, a broad-shouldered man whose scowl seemed permanently etched into his face. His partner, Officer Willis, was younger, thin, and visibly unsure of himself. Grant's baton slapped against his palm as he barked out, "Hey, you, stop right there! What do you think you're doing?" Miriam turned, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Crossing the street," she replied evenly, her voice calm but wary. She raised her hands slightly, a gesture of peace. There weren't any cars coming. Grant's eyes narrowed. "You jaywalked. That's breaking the law. Hand over your ID." Miriam sighed, reaching slowly into her bag to retrieve her wallet. Her movements were deliberate, careful. She held out her ID, and Grant snatched it with unnecessary force, his expression hardening as he scanned the card. "Figures," he muttered under his breath, his disdain palpable. "Excuse me?" Miriam asked, her tone steady but firm. Grant ignored her, stepping closer. "You think the rules don't apply to you? Not on my watch. Hands behind your back." Miriam froze, stunned. "For crossing a street? This is ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" Grant's voice rose. "You're under arrest for jaywalking." "This is absurd," Miriam said, her voice growing sharper as she took a step back. Officer Willis shifted uneasily, glancing at the small crowd that had begun to gather. His hand hovered near his belt, his indecision plain on his face. "Sarge, maybe we should," Willis began. "Quiet," Grant snapped. "I don't need a rookie telling me how to do my job." Before Miriam could say another word, Grant grabbed her wrist and snapped on the handcuffs. The onlookers gasped, their murmurs growing louder. Someone pulled out their phone to record the scene, muttering, "This is insane. Arresting an old woman for jaywalking." Grant shoved Miriam toward the cruiser, his grip firm. She stumbled slightly, but caught herself, her dignity intact despite the humiliation. As the car door slammed shut behind her, Miriam's gaze remained steady. She could feel the weight of every phone camera pointed in her direction. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her tone not threatening but resolute. Inside the cruiser, Grant adjusted the rearview mirror to glare at her. "You're going to learn real quick how things work around here," he sneered. Miriam didn't respond. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. "This is going to blow up online," someone said, their phones still recording. The precinct's back lot was as uninviting as they come, a patch of cracked asphalt littered with discarded equipment and rusting patrol cars. In the corner stood a makeshift holding cage, its bars flaking with rust, the lock looking as old as the cage itself. It was a relic, a forgotten structure that should have been dismantled years ago. But today, it had a purpose. Grant hauled Miriam out of the cruiser, his grip unrelenting. Willis followed, his discomfort growing by the second. "Step inside," Grant ordered, unlocking the cage with a dramatic flourish. Miriam raised an eyebrow, glancing at the cage and then back at him. "You can't be serious." Grant smirked. "Dead serious. Break the rules. Face the consequences." "For jaywalking?" Miriam asked, her voice incredulous. "You realize how absurd this is, don't you?" "Oh, you'll have plenty of time to think about it," Grant retorted, motioning with his baton. "Now get in." Miriam sighed, stepping into the cage. The door clanged shut behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the lot. She settled onto the floor, her composure unshaken. "Well," she said dryly, "I hope the accommodations come with a tetanus shot." Grant laughed, but it was more of a scoff. "Let's see if you're still joking after a few hours in there," he said, turning to leave. Willis hesitated, casting a glance at Miriam before following Grant inside. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lot grew silent, except for the faint hum of distant traffic. Miriam leaned against the bars, her posture relaxed, but her mind sharp. She wasn't panicking. She was observing. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, something was brewing. The video of Miriam's arrest had made its way online, spreading like wildfire. Social media erupted with outrage. "Elderly woman jailed for jaywalking," one post read, accompanied by the now viral video of Miriam sitting in the rusted cage. Hashtags demanding justice trended within hours, and news outlets picked up the story. By nightfall, reporters and advocacy groups were converging on the precinct, their voices amplifying the growing calls for accountability. Inside the precinct, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. The station chief, a weary man who seemed permanently stressed, stood in his office, a cold cup of coffee in hand. Slamming the mug onto his desk, he barked into his intercom, "Get Grant and Willis in here, now." The two officers shuffled into the office moments later. Grant still wore his smug expression, while Willis looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "What the hell were you thinking?" the chief roared, slamming a stack of papers onto his desk. The papers were printouts of angry emails, media reports, and statements from city officials. "You've brought a PR nightmare down on us. The mayor's office is calling, for God's sake." Grant rolled his eyes. "It's just noise. People get riled up, then they move on." "Move on?" the chief repeated, his voice rising. "This isn't going away, Grant. The city council is out front with reporters, demanding answers." Before Grant could respond, there was a knock at the door. An officer poked his head in, looking nervous. "Chief, there's someone here to see you. Says she's with federal oversight." The room fell silent. The chief's face tightened. A moment later, the door swung open, and Miriam Edwards stepped in. Gone was the elderly woman in a floral dress. Now she wore a tailored suit, her hair impeccably styled. Under one arm, she carried a leather-bound folder. Her presence filled the room, commanding attention. "Good evening," Miriam said, her voice smooth but firm. She placed the folder on the chief's desk with an audible thud. "I trust you've had time to review today's news." Grant's smirk disappeared. "You," he began, but Miriam silenced him with a raised hand. "Yes, Officer Grant, it's me," she said, "the woman you decided to humiliate yesterday. But today, I'm here in my professional capacity as a federal investigator for civil rights compliance." The chief paled. Grant stiffened, his jaw tightening. Willis seemed ready to faint. Miriam opened her folder, revealing neatly typed reports. "I've reviewed your department's records," she said, flipping through the pages. "And let's just say yesterday's incident wasn't your first violation, or your second, or your 10th. She looked up, her eyes piercing. "Shall I continue?" The room was silent. "Here's what's going to happen," Miriam said, snapping the folder shut. "Effective immediately, your department is under federal review. Officer Grant, you're suspended pending investigation. Officer Willis, I suggest you find a lawyer." Before leaving, Miriam turned back. "Chief, consider this a wake-up call. Your city deserves better." By the end of the day, Grant was formally charged with misconduct, and Willis quietly resigned. The rusty cage in the back lot was dismantled, and the incident sparked citywide reforms. As for Miriam, she returned to her office that evening, answering emails from advocacy groups and city leaders. She knew this was just the beginning. The battle to dismantle broken systems was far from over, but for now, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile.